We celebrate Easter this year at almost the same time as we're emerging from this latest lockdown, stepping out, blinking from the darkness into the glorious sunlight. Some people have even likened the experience to a kind of resurrection. The hope that so many aspects of our life which have been on hold or which we've been missing, we can now begin again. One of the programs that I've enjoyed watching during lockdown is called Fake or Fortune on BBC Two. Perhaps you've seen it. It's introduced by Fiona Bruce, and it investigates the authenticities of paintings owned by members of the public where the attribution of the painting is in doubt. I like the programme for its extraordinary amalgam of art and detective work as they x-ray various paintings, they take samples of the pigment and they track its provenance, culminating in the thrill of discovering whether the art experts at the end of the programme will declare the painting to be authentic and therefore worth a small fortune, or just a clever forgery. And that brings me to Easter. Was Jesus' resurrection genuine? How do we assess the evidence? Was it faked by a band of loyal disciples? And if so, how on earth did they do it? Are we the victims of the biggest con trick in history? Well, resurrection is certainly not what the disciples were expecting. And it's all the more compelling for that. The cluster of stories in the New Testament about the resurrection of Jesus are full of raw shock and fear and astonishment. But how do we authenticate them? Unfortunately, there were no CCTV cameras around on hand to capture this quite unique and extraordinary event. There were no paparazzi, no press releases, no witnesses whom they might interrogate, just an empty tomb and a stone that had been rolled away, waiting for somebody to discover it. It seems that God had acted in the dark when nobody was around. But as the rumour of life spread, so these primitive stories witnessed to the birth of hope. They describe the gradual transformation of a group of despairing people as they encounter the risen Christ. The resurrection of Jesus did not undo history. The crucifixion happened, and the risen body bears the marks of his execution to prove it. This was no forgery. This was indeed the crucified one. But his appearance had changed, in fact, so radically that his own disciples don't recognize him immediately. Not unreasonably, Mary Magdalene on Easter morning, as she stands weeping beside the empty tomb, assumes that the person who has addressed her is the gardener. A painting whose authenticity has never been challenged is Resurrection in Cookham Churchyard by Stanley Spencer. It's a massive canvas, 9 feet high and 18 feet wide. It depicts the village church and its graveyard on the banks of the River Thames in Cookham in Berkshire, where Spencer lived and worked for much of his life. He completed it not long after the end of the First World War and the terrible Spanish flu pandemic, which swept through the world in 1919 and killed, it is estimated, in excess of 22 million people. Given that historical context of the painting, it's remarkable for its peace, its serenity. In its own way, the painting is quite prophetic. It spoke comfort, healing, and hope to a generation that was severely traumatized and in deep mourning. Spencer interprets the resurrection of the dead literally, in fact, with a realism that takes your breath away. Some people find its very physicality profoundly shocking, disturbing. Personally, I find it very moving. Spencer has people clambering out of their graves, some of them naked, suggesting that resurrection is the birth into a new form of life. Other figures are fully clothed, as though still in the midst of their daily chores. Spencer blurs the boundaries between heaven and earth to show that resurrection is as much a present reality to be experienced here and now in our daily lives as some distant theological reality at the end of time. I particularly like the way in the top left-hand corner of the painting he depicts pleasure boats sailing on the River Thames, carrying people to the joy of heaven. The faces of the people are so happy. There's a sense of fun about it, as though they're on a great adventure. And the image captures perfectly the idea of the heavenly banquet in the Bible. After all, in the Bible, the dominant image of heaven isn't of angels sitting on clouds plucking harps. It's of a gigantic party to which God invites all people. In another section of the painting, by the churchyard path, Spencer paints a couple emerging from a double grave, the wife brushing down the shoulders of her husband's jacket, as she must have done week in, week out, day in, day out, as he toddled off to Cookham Station to catch the train to Waterloo. On the other side of the churchyard path, Spencer paints his first wife, Hilda, who had died a few years earlier, emerging from her grave, bending down and smelling a flower. The whole scene is immensely homely and comforting and not a bit sentimental, and that's why it's so powerful. At the centre of the painting, under a bower of roses growing over the church porch, Spencer places the risen Christ. He doesn't portray Christ as a victorious hero, but surrounded by others as he was in his earthly life. In the painting, the risen Christ holds in his arms two little children, representing, I presume, those who died in infancy. Christ is portrayed as an almost maternal figure, as if he were bringing to birth a new humanity. In the language of St. Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, Christ is the first fruits of the harvest of the dead. The creation has grown and matured. The time for harvest has come. Christ is our brother and our friend, the second Adam of a new, redeemed humanity. Now, when Stanley Spencer was questioned about his painting, he said, "No one is in any hurry in heaven. Here and there things slowly move off, but in the main people resurrect to such a state of joy that they are content." So much of the last year has been the polar opposite of Spencer's bucolic scene. The pandemic has cast a deep shadow over us: uncertainty, anxiety, suffering, fear, death, enforced isolation. This has been our reality, and it has dominated our waking hours. The experience has been oppressive, and it's been depressing. Centuries ago, St. Augustine characterized the human condition as restlessness. Well, restlessness may indeed be our lot, but it's not our destiny. That is the message of Easter, and it's such good news. Disease, suffering, and death do not have the last word. Death has no dominion. Life has the last word. resurrection. Speaking this time of the general resurrection, St. Augustine says, "On that day we shall see and we shall know. We shall know and we shall love and we shall praise in the end that has no end." In this life we are restless and afflicted, but today, in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we glimpse the shape of our destiny and the contentment and joy that flows from being held secure in the loving arms of God. And when we encounter the risen Christ, just as the first disciples did on that Easter morning, we too become bearers of hope, confident in the God who brings life out of death. Christ is risen from the dead, and God will not let us be confounded. Wherever you are in the diocese today, I bid you a very happy Easter. God bless you.